to the Cards and Comic Show.
Welcome back to Cards and Comics. Today I want to talk about graded vintage card scarcity and are they getting harder and harder to find. Now, I went back 5 years and looked at a few cards to determine if this is just a trend or just something that I'm making up in my own head. So we'll get into it right now. So what I first did was I looked at cards that I knew for my own purchase history or for my own search history that I knew were cards that I used to see all the time for sale. And then they started to dry up. And the first one I'm picking on is 65 Mickey Mantle. So there's a few reasons why I picked this card. And number one is the 1965 set is one of the easiest years in the 60s to find PSA 8 cards. Secondly, is they're insanely popular. They're one of the most popular sets of the 60s. So they always are selling because it's very liquid. People always want the 1965 cards, especially the Mantle. It's one of his most popular cards. So looking at the 65 Mantle, I'm going to use the PSA 8 grade because the scarcity I'm seeing is in the higher end grades. So from 7s to some extent, but mostly 8 and above, the cards are just not selling as often based on just my search history and things I'm looking at. So when I went back to 2018, so a 5-year look at the amount of sales, so using VCP, which tracks both auction house sales and eBay sales, you can see that in 2018, this card sold 42 times. In 19, it sold 34 times. And then 2020, it sold 26 times. A little bump in 21 to 31 cards sold. And then it ends 2022 at 21 total sales. Now, if you look at 18 to 22, that's basically a 50% reduction in the amount of cards sold. So this card has a pop count of 455, which looking at the 60s cards, that is not rare for a 60s Hall of Fame 8. So this card has availability, and you can see in 2018 the sales were pretty high, 42 sales. I went back to 17 just to see if this isn't just some random number that maybe 17 sales were much lower, and no, there were actually more sales in 2017 than there was in 2018. So the trend may have started before 2018, but from 2018 to now, you can see this card has gone down in availability by over 50%. That you basically had half the amount of opportunities to purchase this card in 2022 than you did in 2018. Now, when I look at it on a monthly basis, you can see that basically the card was selling 3.5 times a month, or basically with 4 weeks in a month, you can estimate that this was almost selling 1 time a week. So basically once a week you could go out and try to buy this card. And if you look at what's happening in 2022, it's selling about once every other week. So again, half the amount of times it's selling. But what happens when the availability becomes so low, and I'll go through some reasons why I think this is happening, really it does create more eyeballs and it makes the card have more bidders or more people looking for it because they don't have as many chances to buy it. Because when you see a card selling every week, and in 2018 it was mostly on eBay, and I'll show that in a minute, you just wait for the next one, right? You just go, hey, it brought a little bit more and I was willing to pay, I'll just wait till next week because there's going to be another one on. And right now that's not really happening, and that kind of availability issue does drive the price up, in my opinion. Next card I want to look at is the 65 Maze. So I want to take another card. So the Mantle is obviously one of the most expensive cards in the set. The Maze card has gone up tremendously in value, and I'll show that in a minute as well. But the availability is actually higher than the Mickey Mantle, so it's 516 pop count. And you can see in 2018 it sold 11 times more often than the Mantle. But now it's gone all the way down to 13 total sales in 2022. It actually sold a lot less often than the Mantle, even though it has a higher pop count. And so this is very interesting to me. And if you look at the monthly numbers, it went from selling over 4.4 times a month, which is basically more than once a week on average, to basically once a month. So if you think about that, going from once a week to once a month, that's a severe, drastic change in availability of this card. If you're in the market for this card, you basically have one time a month that you can find this card for sale across all platforms that VCP monitors, which is most auction houses and eBay, which also includes PWCC, Golden, Heritage, REA. So again, this is most of the active marketplaces that you would normally find these kind of high-end vintage cards, including Heritage as well. So this is a very stark drop in availability, in my opinion. And you can see when you layer on top of the Mantle, it's a very similar trajectory in terms of availability. Now I decided, let's look at a card from the 50s that I know has high availability, has a lot of desirability, but it's a card, again, that sells pretty often, because when I was purchasing this card, buying this card for the first time, it just seemed like it was always for sale. And that is the 59 Clemente. The 59 Clemente obviously is a card I would have bought for my set, many times. I've had this card multiple times, and I actually own an 8.5 right now. So, but if you look at the Clemente, which is in the gray line here, it sold more often than the Mantle. It has a highest availability of any cards I've looked at, 630 in a PSA 8. And you can see it slowly deteriorated from 46 sales to 15. So it most closely mirrored the Willie Mays 65 more than the Mantle. It's actually selling less often than the Mantle in 2022. And again, this is all sales that are recorded in VCP. I think VCP captures every single sale? No. Cards show sales are not recorded, and nobody really records those sales. But this is, platforms that you would normally be able to go on outside of card shows to find these cards. So this availability change, to me, that 3 random cards that I just picked out of a hat, cards that I know I used to see very often for sale on multiple platforms, that have started to disappear, that they're basically for sale basically once, maybe twice a month max. Sometimes, and if you look at the data, the raw data, you'll see there's certain months where not a single one of these cards sold. So you're having to wait 2 months, maybe 3 months to even find one for sale. And what if it's off center? What if it's not the perfect condition? Now you're waiting another month or 2 to find one. So it makes the search for these cards much more frustrating. But you might be willing to overpay once you find something you really like. And I think that is sort of happening. But this change in availability, to me, I guarantee I could probably put another 5 or 10 cards on here, and we'll see a similar pattern. This isn't just a player issue. This isn't just a set issue. Because I even looked at 72 tops, a Clemente 72 tops, and even the 8 in that set from 21 to 22 has a massive reduction in availability between 21 and 22. Now, before that, you saw some more sales, but from 21 to 22, there's definitely a big drop off. So the difference in 21 to 22 is the most drastic drop for most of these cards. And so that's a very interesting thing that's happening. But I think if you look at the data, I'm going to show you in a minute, it might make more sense. And that is basically the average value by year. So if you look at this chart here, and what I'm going to try to explain is this is the average value for every Mantle, Maze, and Clemente sold in that year. And why that's important is that you can kind of average out if you were to buy a card during that year of 18, 19, 20. This is, on average, you would have paid this amount of money. This is what the average price sold for. And if you take, the average for all three cards, that's the column here where it says average. So on average, all three cards was $1,076. However, if you bought all three of them, you would have paid $4,300 on average. So that would have been your cost to buy all three of these cards. Now, you can look at the Mantle goes from $2,300 to $5,200, so basically a $3,000 increase in price. The Maze goes from $417 to almost $1,600, and the 59 Clemente goes from $476 to $1,500. So you can see both those cards gained over $1,000 in value from 2018 to 22, where the biggest jumps happened between 2020 and 2021, and then carried over into 22. And that's why you see that massive delta between 2018 and 2022 of $6,847 for all three cards. So that's a massive amount. So if you think about it, you could have bought all three cards in 2018 for $4,305. You could have bought almost three of each card for the same price they would cost today. So that's a huge delta. That's a huge difference in value. And so that difference in value is changing how the cards are being sold and maybe how collectors are treating these cards. And to look at that is, if you look at sales by platform, so the total cards, so the three cards together added up, started out in 2018 where 94% of those cards were being sold on eBay. Only 6% of those cards were being sold through Auction House. And I chalk that up because even the Mantle was there, $2,000 card. Now, I chalk this up because in 2019, it was 90%. In 2020, it was 95%. Those were the years, if I go back a slide, in those 3 years, the value of those cards had gone from $1,000 to $1,400. They hadn't really massively increased in price yet. And so auction houses didn't view these cards as being high-end, auction house worthy, heritage auction worthy, whatever you want to say about what a card is auction house worthy. But obviously they weren't, because 95% of them in 2020 were being sold on eBay. Now, there was another massive change between 2021 and 2022, and that's pre-war went from selling only on eBay for the most part to having its own platform and offline auction houses, right? So you can see that from 21 to 22, 21 it went from 95% to 73%, and then in 22 it's almost getting close to 50-50 auction house versus eBay. I think a lot of that has to do with the value of those cards. They've gotten so valuable now, and they're getting so scarce that the auction houses are scrambling to get cards of this value, and right now limited availability to get into their auction houses. So they're not seeing this plethora of vintage cards being sold all the time like they used to, where, I think auction houses just said, well, that's an eBay card because one or two are selling every week. So why should I stick one in my auction when you can just go on eBay? There's always one listed on eBay every week. I think that mentality did affect how the auction houses viewed these cards and their value of $300 or $400 to some extent. $400, $500 didn't rise to be a card that you needed to put in a big time auction. They just didn't bring enough premium. And again, they were so available on eBay. But now the prices have gone up tremendously, and you see that the auction houses now are basically selling almost half of those cards that come up for sale. But you can see the availability went from a total of 141 cards sold in 18 to just 49 cards sold in 2022, which is a massive drop. So I brought up the issue of PWCC. I thought one of my hypotheses was that, well, the big drop off was because PWCC left eBay and basically was selling the same amount of cards just through their own website. However, when you look at the total amount of cards sold by PWCC, so if you take the amount of cards sold that PWCC accounted for, either on eBay or on their private platforms, you can see in 18, the total cards sold of these three players, these three cards, they sold 24% of them, 1 in 4. Then they were basically 1 in 3 in 19, back to 1 in 4 in 2020, back to 1 in 3 in 21. But in 2022, you saw a severe drop off down to 14% of the total cards sold. And on the Mantle, only 1 in 10. Versus 21, they were basically 50% of all sales. And they go down to just 10% of sales. So one of the things that was very shocking to me was that PWCC is no longer the major broker or dealer of these kind of cards. These I call high grade but high availability. A lot of a lot of cards in the pop report, so it's not hard to find. But Pre-War isn't selling these cards anymore. They're selling. When I went and looked online, they have much more availability in PSA 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those grades, than they do 8 or above. So PWCC has sort of switched their own selling platform to be more, I want to say low end, but more collector grade, not the high end. But the other auction houses like Golden and Heritage aren't really picking up the slack. You're not seeing the total sales stay stable. It's continuously dropping in total sales. So the price point has made more people think about selling the cards through auction houses because they're worth more. But that doesn't mean that we're selling more. We're selling much less. And the other thing too is the availability on marketplaces today. So I went out and looked to see, what cards are available on PWCC's website, eBay's website, the common websites that you would go to look to find these cards. I thought maybe, okay, we're only selling 49 of these cards in 22, but maybe there's 30 of them listed on eBay right now, or 40 of them that get you back to that number that you had a couple years ago, because maybe they just all are sitting on eBay and no one's buying them. Maybe they're just sitting there stagnant. Well, when I looked, there's only 5 Mantles, 6 Mazes, and 6 Clementes total listed, and they're not selling because if you look at the 2022 average price for those cards, the Mantle is, the average price of a Mantle on eBay right now is $7,800, which is $2,600 over the 22 average. The Maze is almost $4,000, which is about $2,500 over what the 22 average was. And the average Clemente is about $1,000 over what the 22 average is. So for the most part, most cards listed on eBay are priced so high that you're not going to get any sort of sell through because the pricing is out of whack. That is one of the big problems with eBay's kind of like, and same way for PWCC, if they do list these cards, they're listed at prices that basically won't move. So auctions, are more of a true test to see what the market value is. But from just turning inventory, it's not turning inventory because they're priced so high. But it doesn't really matter. Even if all 5 or 6 of these cards sold, that's not going to make that ratio jump up to what it was in 2018. Even if all these sold, it wouldn't make a dent into the availability like it was in 2018 and before that, because all these cards had more cards sold in 17 than they did in 18. So this trend has started before 18. So this is, to me, concerning as a collector who's looking to complete sets and find and get my Clemente, my Aaron and Maze card collections completed. I've talked about I need a 61 Aaron. I just picked up a 62, and so I can finish out my 60 Aaron collection with the 61. but trying to find a decent one is a challenge. When I completed my Clemente collection, it was a 65 Clemente, and it took me a long time to find one that I was happy with because, again, they just weren't coming up for sale. And I gave up the hope of the 8.5 because it just was almost like, it was so much more scarce, and, I just had to give up because it just wasn't coming up for sale. So there it is, guys. This is sort of, my look at it is 100% true, in my opinion, based on this data, based on just how I look at the markets. I look at vintage cards all the time on eBay. The availability is just not there. It's gone down tremendously. So if you're looking for these cards, if you're trying to complete sets or get your player collection together, you have less cards to pick from. So that means you're probably going to fight more collectors to buy them. That means the market's going to be strong, but there's going to be less sales of that card because just there's not as many of them out there. And I do think people are putting them in permanent collections. They're going into fractional collections. They're going away because the value is there, that people just aren't going to buy them and flip them. When they're $300 to $400 cards, I think it was much easier to flip them. You can see when you go to card shows now, flipping a $7,000, a $5,000 card is much harder. So maybe that's why some of them were sitting there. But again, the availability is not there. It's much harder to find these cards for sale than it was in 2018. There it is, guys. That's my video. Let me know what you think, what experiences you've had trying to buy these cards recently. Do you think the availability has really gone down? And let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.